Hi, my name is Cynthia Wesley-Esquimaux. I'm from the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation in Lake Simcoe, and I want to welcome you this evening to the Rogers show that we're having on Truth and Reconciliation. This is one of those shows that actually helps you to have a better understanding, along with some recognition on what Indigenous peoples have been trying to tell you for the last long while. They've been sending messages about the truth for a very significant amount of time, and many of you have heard some very interesting and I think tragic news over the last while. So we want to share some thoughts about where reconciliation might be going. But we've been telling stories off the land. We've been telling you prophecy. Our elders have been speaking up, and the healing has been happening in our communities. So today we want to have a conversation about truth and reconciliation, and the question of reconciliation from my perspective, and you'll hear from other people as we move through the program, I think rests more in the hands of Canadians and the important decisions that have to be made following what I would call a very intensive learning process. And of course, that learning process is going to include many of the hidden truths of Canadian history. So the first thing I want to do is I want to introduce you to each of these people that will be speaking this evening, this afternoon, whenever you're listening to this. So the first person is Sherry Lawson. She's from the Chippewas of Rama. She's a middle daughter of an Anishinaabe father and an Algonquin mother, and she grew up in a very political household, as I understand it. So I'm going to give Sherry a couple moments to introduce herself, and then we'll move on to the next person. Take it away, Sherry.
Anin Bojo, everyone. Nin Manjikani Kwa, Sherry Nadijnakas Ramadunjaba. In my language, that means my name's Lawson. I live in Rama, or as a traditional name is Manjikaning, people of the fish fence, and I am Loon Clan, which gives me a very special position in creation that we don't have time for today. I guess I can say a few little things about myself. I'm retired now, but I've worked on for federal, provincial, and municipal governments over the last 50 years. I'm known as a public speaker, an MC. I've had some very high-profile jobs in the community, so a lot of people think they know me. And if you Google me, you turn up a whole bunch of crazy stuff that might not even have anything to do reality, but I have been involved in Indigenous jobs and questions and all kinds of things like that for a very, very long time. So I have seen it all. I'm trained as a librarian, as an anthropologist. I also was a Justice of the Peace for 10 years. I've been a casino executive. There isn't anything I haven't done. Well, there are two things. I never drove a cab, and I haven't been a nun, but that ship has sailed. So I'm really glad to be here today with Cynthia and the others.
Thank you, Sherry. That's a good one. I guess you understood what nun meant. All right, and I'd like to introduce Roxanne Shank. She's a Métis citizen. Great-grandfather was Roger Goulet, hosted the rebellion forces before the Battle of Fish Creek. And her grandmother, Rosina Goulet, saw the end of the buffalo herds, received some scrip, and traveled by boat to Athabasca. And like most of us, life is a pretty colorful tapestry with lots of Indigenous concerns. So Roxanne, maybe to give us a little bit more about who you are.
Hi, everybody, and thank you for having me here. What can I tell you about myself? Like a lot of Métis, it's been a journey which is continuing to rediscover my identity as a Métis citizen. My Métis citizenship card goes back to 2000. The Métis Nation of Ontario has only officially been around for about 24 years. So compared to my friends in this room, we are in many ways newcomers. I had the opportunity when I was in law school to work on the residential school settlement. And I was working through I spent all of my last semester and third year working on it. And it was an eye-opener. It was an eye-opener. Obviously, I knew a lot of it anecdotally through my community, but to realize that the behavior was calculated and systemic, that there was medical experimentation, sterilization, was just really, truly horrific. Since then, I've had the opportunity to serve on the Georgian Bay Métis Council for about 7 years. And then the new Barrie Council came along a couple of years ago. And I'm currently functioning as its president, very honored to do so. We're really working hard to reach out to the community. A lot of our people, and I say this inclusively, are really hurting right now. We've started a food bank. We've started a youth camp. There are just so many ways where our peoples are being forgotten, and we're trying to fill in the gaps.
Yeah, there's a lot going on for sure. Okay, and I'd like to introduce Shanna Lickers as well. She has what we call lived experience as a Haudenosaunee Mohawk woman, and over 15 years of professional experience working in violence against women in the social services sector. So Shanna, Shanna, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, my status card is Oneida, but I was raised as Mohawk through my grandmother. We lived in the city off and on Six Nations Reserve. I lived in several cities. My most important job is mothering 7 children. I've been doing self-healing since I was 18, many years. I started out thinking, it was for my kids, later on down the road is when I did my deeper healing. But it turned out it's for myself, trying to change their life, because I grew up in a life of trauma and violence and extreme alcoholism with all kinds of abuses. So I did a lot of work to change that for my children. We live in Barrie now currently. I have worked with violence against women. I've worked in Native organizations, as well as right now I work in the shelter, helping women who are fleeing from abuse and trauma. So that's me.
Okay, thank you for that. I know that there's that you bring you're going to bring a very important perspective to this conversation as well. I'd also like to introduce Steve Clark. He's presently the mayor of Orillia. He has a lengthy track record of support for Orillia and has been part of the reconciliation process that we've been engaged in. And I know that he cares a great deal about the people in this community and the reconciliation and the truth that's going on in this world. So Steve, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself as well?
Thanks, Cynthia, and thanks to you and Rogers for this opportunity. Yes, I am the mayor of what is coined the Sunshine City, the city of Orillia. It is interesting, I grew up in the shadows of Beausoleil First Nation, growing up in the Midland area, and went to high school with a number of Menegs and Copagogs and some other wonderful folks from Christian Island. And then, of course, the last 30 years of my life, I've had Sherry as a neighbor, along with the rest of the people in Rama. And you think that would give me, along with a formal and informal education, a pretty good perspective on the state of affairs with our Indigenous friends around the province and beyond. But quite frankly, it didn't. I'm embarrassed, and for those that have heard me say this before, I apologize for the repetition. As I say, being formally and informally fairly well educated, coming to the mayor's office in 2014 as I did, and not having the education that I believe is absolutely necessary to move reconciliation forward is a big hole that I believe needs to be filled, and I can speak a little bit more about that later. But anyway, certainly a very willing partner. I as I look around the screen, I'm very honored and privileged to be here with this group today, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. I'm a neighbor too.
Fair enough.
All right. So, and then our last but not least is Jared Big Canoe. Jared Big Canoe is from the Chippewas of Georgiana Island. He's from the same community as I am. In fact, he's a relative. He's also an entrepreneur extraordinaire, as I understand it, and also a rapper of some renown. So, Jared, maybe tell us a little bit about what you do and where you're coming from.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My honor to be here. First, I'd like to say As far as being Indigenous, it is an honor. Sometimes it's a struggle. It's mainly an honor. As a young Indigenous person, I feel a huge responsibility to bring parts of our culture back, like food sovereignty, allowing us as people to eat our traditional diet again. I really want to champion that. And recently I've been hired on my First Nation as the wild rice coordinator. So as our people used to eat wild rice as a staple in our diet, it's something that our First Nation sees important that we revive as a part of who we are. So I'm very honored and blessed to be able to carry that role. And I also do some performances, like I'm a rapper, but I'm also a singer. And it's just, it's an honor for me to carry these parts of our culture that I can share with the next generation. I'm just very happy to be here today. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jared. It's good for you to be here. So I'm not going to tell you a whole lot about me, but I mean, I can answer questions as we go forward. Suffice to say that, reconciliation is an important part of the work that I do. I have a chair for Truth and Reconciliation at Lakehead University. I've been there for 9 years, 6 of those doing this particular kind of work. So I have an understanding that there is a lot of aspects and a lot of elements to this particular conversation. But we're going to ask some questions of our panel, and I want to start with Sherry. And I know that Sherry has been a long-standing Indigenous advocate. It's her life work like it is my life work. But I want to ask you, Sherry, what has been your most challenging initiative? And you can relate it to reconciliation if you'd like, and tell us why. Why has it been challenging?
Well, when I look back on the last 50 years or so of the community work I've done, and when I think about this deeply, something strikes me that as the mayor has said, we haven't taught people very much. We've had all this time. Excuse me. I think about in my early days, how I went out to some of the school groups, everything from kindergarten to grade 7. I was part of panels talking about what the kids should be when they grow up. I've spoken to women's shelter staff and business people, chambers of commerce, conferences, tourism, all kinds of all across the country. And it's still interesting to me that in 2022, I'm almost starting from nothing. Who are we as Indigenous people? What do we represent? What do we stand for? Where do we belong? I grew up in a household that was part Catholic and part traditional. So I was able to take all the parts of that fit me the most and help me the most. And so I know the ceremonies. I know a little bit of the language. I know when the full moon is coming, what the women have to gather and get ready and do. And I look sometimes around me at the people outside our Indigenous communities and think, how could they not have been paying attention all this time? And, I asked one of our elders a few years ago before she went on to the spirit world, Merle Assance Beatty, and I said, Merle, we've totally blown it in teaching the world about who we are and how kindness is really important to us. Family is important to us. Sharing is important to us. And she said, it's not all their fault out there. She said, when they first came here, we gave them everything they needed. We gave them our medicine people, the best place to sleep, showed them where the trails were, showed them how to catch the animals, showed them what kind of plants would heal. And then they went back home and said, those people are nice over there. We should go over and take a few more people with us. She said, we didn't really teach them who we are and what we stand for. I'm fortunate that in my life, I know who I am, where I belong, and what I stand for as an Indigenous woman. But a lot of our neighbors and even my friends don't know that. I think of some of the things that have happened over the last little while. When my late husband passed away about 5 years ago, all my friends from all over the place were here to help me, to prop me up. Two of my friends from town, Ellen and Pat, came and they said, well, you have to get ready for the funeral. And I said, well, one thing I need to do is make tobacco ties. And they said, oh, okay, maybe we can help you with that. So I brought all the 4 items that I need to make the tobacco ties, and I laid them out on the table. And I said, okay, Ellen, you're on ribbon. Pat, you're working the scissors. I'll put the tobacco into the ties. And they looked at me, and Pat said, when do you think these 2 white women from town learned how to make a tobacco tie? And to me, it was like breathing. How could people not know this? So we have to take some of the blame teaching the world about who we are, but we're given another chance here. Our stories have been talking for generations about how we as Indigenous people will be here at the end of time. And I truly believe that. And I teach my children and grandchildren that we're being given a chance to teach the world again, because we didn't do it well the first time or the second time or the fourth time. We didn't do it well when there was the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People in Canada, where people spoke for weeks about the trauma they suffered during residential schools when they mentioned the scoop. It's like nobody heard it. That 9-volume series of reports sits dusty on shelves somewhere. When I think about going out to speak to all the different groups, it's surprising to me still that they know so little about us. And we have been here for a very, very long time. A lot of people, Indigenous people, are all the same. They believe all the same thing. A lot of people believe that we're totally different. We're not like the Mohawks. We're not like the people from the East Coast. So they have this very unusual way of looking at Indigenous people. And what I want to tell them is, to spend time with us as Native people, as Indigenous people. That's the only way you're going to learn about who we are and what we stand for. And doesn't matter if I'm speaking to 5-year-olds in a school, or whether I'm speaking to University Women's Club in downtown Toronto with 700 people in the audience, they're still asking the same questions. So that's very, very challenging for me. Again, the beginning.
That's been a very challenging thing, I think, for everyone. And I agree with you. And thank you so much for sharing that. So I want to move to Jared. Jared, I hear you with what you're saying about, stepping up for climate, stepping up for food security, water security, so you're taking, I want to know where you're taking your strongest stand and let us know, what do you hope to achieve and, and when?
Okay, thank you. Well, for me, it's almost like, I stopped trying to make plans and push for what I want and just kind of let the spirits of my ancestors, I know this sounds kind of cliche, but let my ancestors tell me what they want me to do with my life. So I ended up falling into this role of the wild rice guy. Now, I told friends of mine from Lake First Nation, Christian Island, that I wanted to start with fish. Next week, they're dropping off fish for me to sell. And now I'm into smoking fish and delivering fish to people, because my main objective and goal is to create a way for elders who miss this traditional diet to access it. So I figured if I could make it so that there's a delivery service where you can get traditional food, that's where I would start. And for me, I feel like the strongest stand is just pushing for everyone to move back to the food that we ate traditionally, because that's going to give us the best chance at fighting chronic diseases like heart disease and diabetes and things like that come from the diet of our society these days.
Very true.
So it has a lot to do with food. Sorry, it's just a food thing. That's like where it starts, I guess. I don't know.
We all need food, Jared. We're all good to go with that. And we'll have to have a conversation about hydroponics at some point too. Shana. Shana. God, I have a real hard time with Shana. So yes. You said that you do some work with violence against women. And I know that is an incredibly intractable problem globally. Like there's a lot of conversations about this. And I mentioned in the question for you that Lee Maracle, I had talked about Lee Maracle, and she had talked about how there was a direct correlation between what's happening to the planet, what's happening to the earth, which is feminine, we call it Mother Earth, and what's happening to women in our communities in particular, but it's happening to women everywhere. What do you think about that connection? Do you agree with that connection, or do you see another kind of a connection that needs to be talked about?
Well, I was taught that Mother Earth is part of the planetary family. Mother Earth, Father Sky, Grandmother Moon, Grandfather Sun. And I was in my teachings growing up, it was you are respectful and you're a caretaker of the land, and you treat the land with kindness and respect, and you don't abuse, the resources. That's that type of thing. And I think it's very similar with how Mohawks as matriarch where the women made all the major decisions and women had a strong voice. Women had strong leadership. So I do see that it's very similar. I know that when the people came over and took over the land, or however the history went with that, I think that women weren't as viewed so much as equal. I mean, I know they didn't have a right to vote, didn't have a right to go to school and all these things, but in my culture before this happened, before Canada became Canada, we were equal and we were viewed that way. And we had very important roles, very strong leadership roles. So I do see a connection, because it wasn't a mentality of the earth is here to support my needs. It was more like, how do we care for the earth, right? Similar to women, the view on women from what I witness is, my opinion is women were there to suit the male's needs, right? And I've seen that in many areas. Yeah, it's a deep conversation.
Yeah, it is. It's an important one, I know, because of all of the different things that are happening. And we don't seem to be able to make a real dent in the domestic violence piece. It seems to continue to go.
No.
Work
Well,
on
it's so far, like you said, it's so far gone, so many layers of abuse and trauma and oppression and racism and everything on top of everything on top of everything, right? Where do we start? And then you've got the murdered Indigenous human trafficked women that never get recognized or nobody's done much about. And, don't talk about that. And, that's as far as it's gone, it's so far gone. Where do we start?
Where do we start? Yeah, thank you for that. And Roxanne, as a lawyer, I wanted to ask you about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the conversation that has been raised across Canada around restorative practice. We brought stuff from Europe, we brought our law from Europe, and we utilize it in this country. But what do you think the chances are of our actually creating a truly Indigenous informed law out of the United Nations Declaration here in this country?
Good question. I would say I'm cautiously hopeful, and the reason why I'm cautiously hopeful is, while events appear to move at a glacial pace, as John Burroughs said recently, we're seeing events happen that we never thought we'd see in our lifetime. The Pope's apology, Trudeau's recognition of that apology, Mary Simon, our Governor General's wonderful words about truth and reconciliation,
Children being found.
All of these things are just so very, very powerful. Just to unpack this a little bit, if there's a legal doctrine called terra nullius, which basically means that the Europeans showed up and they looked around and they said, hey, nobody's here. And, so we can just move in and claim title to everything. We own everything. We own the sky, we own the land, we own all the resources of the water and the land. It's free for the taking, because there are no organized societies or governments or anybody here. And that is the colonial dialogue. That's the script. And professors like John Burroughs and others, Gray and whatnot, they're coming up and they're going, no, that isn't the way this is going to work going forward. Not only, as Shanna said, we had governments, we had organized societies, we had laws that existed for thousands of years, whether they were matriarchal, patriarchal.
Yeah.
We respected the land. We respected everything that walked and flew and crawled on it, and saw ourselves as true carekeepers, not stewards in the biblical sense, but carekeepers of the land. And what is being proposed now, and I brought my gift of sweetgrass that I had been given by an elder for some centering, and also to illustrate an To continue to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results
Insanity.
is toxic and it's crazy. And I believe, which is why I'm cautiously optimistic, at the cusp of saying to the governments of Canada, of Ontario, frankly, around the world, because it isn't just Canada dealing with this, Australia, it's South America, etc.
Globally, yeah.
We are here and we were always here, and our system of government and laws and us as unique and identifiable nations pre-existed you walking in on the curb. And we are asking very nicely, but very firmly, any movement forward using UNDRIP, the UN declaration, needs to inclusively, just as a braid has 3 pieces to it, no longer is it just Eurocentric colonial law at the federal or provincial or community level. One of the very important parts of the braid is that the Indigenous laws are given full respect. Right. And the Indigenous laws are going to inform this whole process of dialogue and healing so that it can move us all forward, as Mary Simon says, towards some form, and I cringe at the word of reconciliation. I like healing.
Yeah.
I feel better about healing
we can
myself.
Use either one. Yeah, we can use either one. So yeah, that's thank you for that. I agree. It's a tough word, so we can come back to that. So I want to ask Steve though, because a final question, because Steve, you've been involved. I know you've been involved in some of the conversations of reconciliation because I've been there with you in some of those circles. So either from your personal or from your political perspective, I'd like to hear from you. Because you come into this conversation, you're not Indigenous. You, as you mentioned, you've lived with, close to Indigenous peoples. You've had lots of experience now. What do you think it's going to take to get the rest of our society involved? Let me just share this with you. I had a conversation with former Prime Minister Paul Martin at one point, and he said to me, Cynthia, 40% of the population of Canada knows there needs to be change, and they're on side. 30% of them, they don't want anything to do with it. They don't want to talk about it. They really don't care. And 30% are sitting on the fence. He said, so what you really need to do is forget the 30% in the middle, work with the 30% on the fence, the 40% who know that change needs to be made, build critical mass, push legislation, law, whatever jurisdiction, authorities, whatever you need to do, and make it happen. And I don't know, what do you think, Steve? Because you're a part of that, your larger community as the mayor of a fairly substantially size city.
Yeah, thanks. I think you've hit on a couple of interesting pieces. First of all, the shame when the Kelowna Accord failed to move ahead when that Paul Martin had spent so much time putting forward, because I think that might have moved this process ahead earlier than it's going to move ahead. But anyway, my personal feeling is for understanding, for buy-in, for appropriate action going forward. I'm going to go back, and I'm trying not to be myopic on where I believe a lot of energy should go, but I do believe it needs to go into education. And I believe that can happen on a number of fronts. As I mentioned earlier, I've been fairly well formally educated, informally, and still I lacked a lot of information. I was aware of the residential school system, but not to the extent that it took place and the effects that it had for generations. I was unaware that Indigenous peoples didn't even have the right to vote until somewhere around 1960, when they could fight world wars and other wars for Canada. I was unaware that they needed permission to leave their reserve without written permission. I was unaware for the most part of the 60s scoop. And although I was aware of some of the aspects of racism, certainly not knowledgeable enough. I say all that to lay the groundwork because I believe now as I think Roxanne said, we might be on a cusp. And certainly that is my feeling. I believe that the time is ripe for a number of things to happen. I do believe that we need formal and informal education. The informal education can happen in a variety of ways. It happened in a very unfortunate way about 14, 15 months ago with the discoveries of the children's graves in various parts of Canada, especially in BC. And as unfortunate as that was, it was an education for many of us in Canada who maybe not understood the full extent of the harm of the residential school system. And I believe that did significantly affect a lot of that 30% that you were referencing, Cynthia. So education can happen informally, but I do believe strongly that the best way to get the most people educated is through our public school system, and that's through elementary school, secondary school, and post-secondary. To that end, and not to fluff anybody's pillow at all, but the surrounding mayors and myself and the warden penned a letter a number of months ago to the province asking them to bring the Indigenous aspect of our education into the 21st century, and that's something I'm hoping not to let go until it happens, because right now it seems to be a bit of a patchwork quilt around Ontario with different boards of education doing some things and others not doing some things, or somewhere in between. So the other thing that I believe can happen is I believe a lot of communities can, despite what may happen in our provincial curriculums or curricula, is that we can take action municipally. And I do believe that every community should probably have an EDI, and equality, diversion, and inclusive committee that is community-based, that is stakeholder-based. And we are just in the midst of moving into that formal template right now, and with Rama First Nation being such a significant and vital partner of Aurelia, it is my hope and belief that they will be a significant part of that.
Great, good. Well, yeah, and I think those are important. So now we've heard from Sherry, we've heard some really important history. We've heard that out of that history came some violence and some very unfortunate traumas. We've heard from Jared that there's a way to somehow mitigate that. He's actually picking up the need to do that teaching and to ensure that people are aware, and that education process is very different from each of these people, but it's present. And of course, Roxanne, from the question of the law and the United Nations Declaration, the larger pieces of legislation and other kinds of things that are out there that are sort of moving things along are also very important. And Steve, the whole question of education, whether it's public or private or in schools from K to really to PhDs, people need to have an opportunity to have that learning. I don't think there's any way to stop that. Shanna, go ahead.
Yeah, can I add something to what was being said? In my opinion, I think the truth needs to be told.
Yes.
Accurate details need to be told and heard, listened to, and some clear, honest, open communication, I think would really help start the educated process.
Yeah.
In order to teach the education, you have to know what it is.
Yeah.
Cynthia, if I could just add to Shanna's comment, Shanna, you're bang on, because I was negligent in not adding that the education really is the truth. It's the good, it's the bad, and it's the ugly.
All of it.
And for people to have a proper perspective, they need to have that. So thank you for filling that in. Very, very valid point.
Yeah, go ahead, Roxanne. Yeah, the truth.
Steve, just to echo what you said, some communities, for example, with Beausoleil and Christian Island and Rama, they do really, really well in having representation in the Indigenous advisory groups for the school boards. Others, not so well. And I want to say from a big picture and a small picture perspective, the seat at the table can't be a concession. The seat at the table should be one of equality. Indigenous laws should be treated with deference and respect by the judiciary, by the academic community, and particularly by the lawmakers. I want to see UNDRIP create a groundswell of recognition of this form of deference and equality, and that will infuse all kinds of socioeconomic discussions. Instead of us coming to the table with our little bowl saying, please, sir, can we have some more? We will already be at the table making these decisions. And admittedly, I'm a glass half full gal, but I do think that, you know, it took 14 years for Canada to sign on to UNDRIP, but now that it has, I see that door being cracked open, and you know, I'm hopeful that we can all walk through it with our heads high together, because I think it's got to be active listening and respect.
Yeah. I think, you know, that, you know, those, you know, and again, a lot of people, you know, we're not actually addressing all 90, you know, there are 94 calls to action for those of you that are watching this that are not familiar with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that wrapped up its work after 7 years in 2015. And now it's 2022. And those 94 calls to action are still standing. Some of them have been fulfilled. The most recent, I suppose, with the Pope being here, you know, call to action 58. There are lots of calls to action that have been addressed. They're not all for government. They're actually, many of them are for us. You know, some of them are for education. Some of them are for child welfare. Some of them, 18 of them are for the justice system. 18. You know, so there's a lot about justice that has to be addressed. Some of them are for sports. Some of them are for economics. You know, some of them are for the churches to accommodate. So there's 94 calls to action. Many of them are being fulfilled as we speak. Many of them are, people don't really know what to do with that. And then there are 10 principles that are also guiding this conversation. So it's not that people are not paying attention necessarily. It's just that some people don't have that education that Steve is talking about and have no access. So there have been changes. I think, Sherry, you and I are the same age. We know that what it was like when we were young and what it's like now. And there is ears that are open. You know, Roxanne, I think people are listening. Maybe not all people are listening, but a lot of people are listening. Shauna, you know that that we've had some issues around domestic violence that have not gone away. And Jared, you're doing the work you're doing because you can see that one of the most important things that we have to address from a lot of perspectives is our health. Indigenous health has suffered tremendously under the Indian Act. So the whole question of food security and going back to traditional diets is a really important one. But what are the kinds of changes? I mean, if you've seen a change that you think is one of the most important changes for you, what would that be? And anybody, what do you see? What has changed from your perspective that you think is worth talking about?
From my perspective of a youth on the reserve, I've seen a lot of despair and hopelessness amongst my peers. But now as we regain our culture and regain a sense of who we are, maybe a little bit of our language, you start to kind of fill up this void that's inside you, and it creates a sense of pride and a little bit of something to be proud of. So now that, us as getting more mature and letting those immature lifestyles kind of fall to the side, we're able to pick up our culture and use that as the map to the path forward. So something to kind of rally around and leave for the next generation. So as a young person, I've always felt a responsibility as far as like our language. Our language is something that they say is possibly somewhat dying. So we have a job to do to make sure that it still lives in the next years to come, right? So as a young Indigenous person, I feel a responsibility. And I feel like that road, if we were to pick the road of like our culture and what that gives to us, it really gives us a way out of a lot of that hopelessness and the negative that we would feed into or feel as Indigenous people.
Okay, and we all have children. I mean, most of you have mentioned children. So what kinds of things are you doing, Shanna, to be able to ensure that those 7 children that you're raising are going to have a different kind of a life than you had? What's the important thing for you?
For me, it's education. That's very important. I've got a few kids in college, one in university and two that are going. I said 2 years is all I need and that's it. And I'll be happy with whatever you do. I think being educated, having those opportunities, it's helpful to have monies to be able to do that. I'm seeing more Indigenous people being in higher positions, which is helping with some of the programming and the things run on the reserve. Some are able to provide some more of that in like the native centers and into the programming, which, you know, is helping, I think, a lot because, you know, my children are part of these up and coming things, right?
Yeah.
I like the land acknowledgement being in the schools. I think that is a huge, that's something I never thought I would see.
Yeah.
You know, and just acknowledging that this land was, we were here on this land, right? And for people to be aware of that. And my kids to have that. Yeah, my kids to have that sense of connection, right? I would like for them to learn more about the culture, though. I would like to see more different nations having that opportunity that if you're not predominantly Ojibwe, to have other opportunities to be connected with like Mohawk language. I wanted to take a Indigenous course in Georgian College and they offered it in Ojibwe language. And I asked, you know, can you put that in Mohawk language, right? I would like to see more of availability and recognition that we're all different nations. We're not all one under one definition, right?
Yeah. Sherry, what about you? What do you think is the most important thing so that your kids and your grandchildren have a different kind of a life?
Well, I want to say miigwech to Roxanne for bringing out the sweetgrass there. And one of the first things I was taught as a young kid was those pieces of sweetgrass in the braid stand for kindness, honesty, sharing, and together there's strength. So imagine if everybody in the whole country knew just that.
Yeah.
That's where we're in when you put those three things together, and together there's strength.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the whole thing, right? There's some very simple but profound knowledges that people need to be able to live a good life. Those grandfather teachings, you know, about honesty and respect and humility, like those are really important teachings, and they're not complicated, but they're very important. Roxanne, anything you think that it's like, you know, this is the most important thing for me because of my family, my children, my grandchildren to have or know?
It's not unique to the Métis by any means. All of our nations have lived through a legacy of shame and silence. I was just at the first annual General Assembly of the Métis Nation of Ontario in Toronto, the first in a couple of years,
Yes.
2-3 years, a few weeks ago. And it was wonderful, you know, echoing Jared, to see all the young people there who wanted to learn their language, who wanted to understand their culture, who had their heads high, and who were proud to wear the symbols of the Métis Nation, whether it's, you know, the sash or anything else. And I will not live to see this actualized. I'm 68. I do this, and my prayer every time I do anything for the community is for my children and my children's children. I'm looking at the long game. I'm looking at being a spark of light that hopefully moves everyone forward. I was looking at, you know, what the Governor General Mary Simon said on the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, almost a year ago, September 29th, 2021. And she talks about uncomfortable truths, but she says the truth can unite us as a nation. And she was referring to Canada. And then she said, reconciliation is a way of life, continuous with no end date.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like that idea that it's a path forward. And I can urge everyone who watches this, take it with us.
Yeah, for sure. See, what about you? What would you say from your perspective? I mean, you've gotten, you're moving forward, you got some education. What is the gift that you want to bring to this conversation on truth and then reconciliation?
Just to move back to the children thing, because my hope lies in certainly in this generation that I think most of us are a part of on this call, and certainly the next generation and my children's generation. My hope and belief is that there's a more natural understanding and a more natural inclusivity with my children's generation. I know there are exceptions to that, and there will continue to be, but I hope that they are diminished for whatever reason. So I do believe that, again, to harp on the education, to the degree that we can educate them, we'll bring them along. The degree that they may see our education or our attitude, rather, or the attitude of the generation that we're part of, changing and evolving and becoming more understanding, inclusive, and inclusive, will bring them along as well. I do believe, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, for various reasons, but certainly with reconciliation, they need to see role models that they can aspire to be like. I mean, I suppose the end goal is to have our Indigenous friends and partners take more pride in their past. To hear Jared speak of what was going on, and others speak about what was going on at different on reserve and at different conferences is heartwarming. Anyway, feeling more pride, embrace their culture, and then hopefully moving together with non-Indigenous as well. The one thing that I hope I'm not turning this conversation around a little bit, and Sherry and I have conversations around a piece of history that was part of Aurelia's history and interfaced with Indigenous history over 400 years ago, and that's Champlain's venture into this area and the Champlain Monument. I've had a valuable lesson out of that. Right around the time when we put the working group together with Parks Canada and the city and with Rama and some folks in the community at large, I also did a trip to Auschwitz, to Germany, Poland, and Israel. Obviously, it was a Holocaust tour, and of course, it was compelling and moving. And I remember sitting in the front of a death camp doing an interview with CBC. This is in Germany. Doing an interview with CBC on the Champlain and on reconciliation, and that was my most compelling moment as a mayor, because it was I won't get into all the details now, but I did see some interlacing of issues. My point is, Auschwitz has not been bulldozed, and of course, it saw over 1.1 million people murdered on that site. And if we're not going to have things like the Champlain Monument around, and perhaps we should not, then we need to make sure that we have other ways of triggering education, because my belief is an empty field does not trigger important conversations. But the lesson I've actually learned out of this is it's not what I want. It's what the people that have endured the negative aspects of colonialism for 400 years. It's what they want.
And I think you should know that, and in Sherry or Roxanne, Shanna have something probably to say about this, that the residential schools, the almost 400 residential schools across this country, and Indian hospitals, many have been left standing for exactly that reason. And yet others have been turned into different kinds of institutions that our people can actually utilize for good. So there is a movement forward to try to, ensure that, first of all, it doesn't get forgotten. I don't know how many of you all know that many of the records have been set to be destroyed. The records, the testimonials of people that went through the residential school period, because we lost that particular battle. Maybe not entirely yet. We're still working on it. But the idea was that, they would be preserved and protected and not destroyed, because 100 years from now, we don't want people to say, well, nothing ever happened in Canada, when in fact, a lot of people put their lives on paper and on video about what had happened to them in those schools. And as Shanna's talking about, the violence against Indigenous peoples and the missing and murdered Indigenous women, it all comes from those. That's where it stems from, is those atrocities that happen to Indigenous peoples, and still in some ways are happening, whether it's in our hospitals or other places. I mean, Indigenous peoples are not, getting a free pass today. It's a great time to be Indigenous. I will say that, and I feel that very strongly. And I tell young people like Jared that all the time. It's a great time to be Indigenous, because people are actually listening to you and seeing you. But at the same time, there's still a lot of work to do. Any last words from anybody? Sherry, Roxanne?
I just wanted to leave us with a very old story. I was to many times as a young girl from my Nokomis, from other elders in the community. They told us that there were still going to be rough times ahead. I remember my grandmother saying that, I don't know how many times, when I got shipped off to school to go to town, or when they talked bring down this building or that building. And she said, you can worry about it, Sherry Lynn, but you yourself are going to fix it. But what you need to know is our very old and ancient stories always told us that it'll be the children who will lead the way. And there we have young, can't call him a child anymore, but he is one of the young people leading the way. And we could not have foreseen that the finding of those graves of young children would make this conversation sweep across this country. The children truly are leading the way, as was foretold.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. Roxanne, you wanted to last words?
I just wanted to say miigwech for that, Sherry. So well said. And, many years ago, Supreme Court in a course called Vanderpeet said, in effect, when the Europeans showed up in North America, the Aboriginal people were already here. And I just want to say, we're here.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And we're not going anywhere. And we're willing to work with you as equals. Don't lose sight of the fact that we are here.
Thank you. Shanna, a few last words.
For me, I think I would just like to see this to be a time for healing. I think I like that word healing, to reconcile back to relations. For me, it starts within, and everybody needs it on different levels.
And on all Canadians. This is not just about Indigenous people healing. This is about all Canadians who have been dramatically and directly affected by what happened. It is not just about us. It is about all of us.
Everybody.
Yes. And Jared, any last words for us?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say that, it's an honor to be a part of this conversation as we bring up truth and reconciliation, start the conversation so that everyone in Canada can create a better future together. And, that's why I decided to be here today. Thank you. I'm very grateful to be amongst all these beautiful people and their opinions and their views of the world that we live in today. And I hope that we can all just do our part to make it a better place for everyone. So thank you.
Thank you. And I wanted to say, for people that are watching that are wondering, well, what do I do? We're not asking for necessarily grand gestures. We're asking for you to do what your heart tells you to do and listen to the things that are possible for you and your family. Educate yourself, educate your family members at your church, wherever you hang out with a lot of people. Make sure that you think about the curriculum that your students, your children and your grandchildren are taking. Make some suggestions to the school. Start a scholarship if necessary. Be supportive. Take the time to make friends, not just be an ally, but be friends with Indigenous people and get to know somebody and have lunch. I always say, people, if you really want to know somebody well, break bread with them.
I like lunch.
Personal time, right? Or have you take a lunch. But do something that makes it possible for this to be a very personal journey for you. Are we going to see truth completely, are we going to see reconciliation in our lifetimes as, those of us that are here on this panel? Possibly not. But, as Roxanne has pointed out, and as the Governor General's pointed out, it is an ongoing journey that we're all on and we're all a part of, and all of our children and Jared, your daughter, and all of the people that we know and love are going to be a part of that. So we'd like to thank you for participating tonight and for watching this and being a part of this conversation. And please feel free to touch base with us whenever you want to, whenever you can. And we're absolutely open to help and support and questions. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Chimigwech.
Yahweh.
Miigwech.
Good.
Miigwech, Marcy.